So the first of two readings this morning is actually a traditional tale from Liberia in West Africa. Once there lived in Africa a man who had more than anyone else in his village. His barns were filled with rice, his corral was thick with cows and goats, his huts were filled with healthy children. But this man, he had one serious problem. For some reason, he could not keep warm. Even when the sun was hot enough to bake clay pots, he was shivering. He bought many blankets for his bed, but that didn't help at all. His wife, she heated stones and placed them at his feet, but still his teeth chattered and his bones shook. "This is a very bad sickness," the man said to himself. "I must find the wisest medicine man in the land and ask him for a cure. Since I have more wealth than anyone else, surely I can buy myself warmth." The miserable man went from healer to healer, but none of them were able to help. Finally, he came to the oldest and the wisest of them all. And the old wise man said to the wealthy, cold man, "You are chilled because of the hate of those around you who have so much less than you. All around you there are adults and children who are aching with hunger while your belly is full. People always hate those who have the most of everything." "You have not cured me," the cold man complained through his chattering teeth. "You've only identified my illness." "You have to cure yourself," the medicine man said, shaking a warning finger. "And to do that, to cure you, you must give away all of your wealth." The cold man felt even colder when he heard those words. The thought of giving his goods away was a very unpleasant one, but his longing to feel warmth was so great that he finally decided that, well, perhaps I can part with some of the grain in one of my barns. And he did so. But when he had done this, the miserable man was just as cold as before. Thinking that he had not shared enough, he emptied his entire barn into the eager hands of the hungry. Still he was cold. Desperate, but without any sense of pleasure in what he was doing, the man emptied a third barn and gave all of his rice to those who had none, and yet still he felt cold. In the end, the man gave away so much of his grain that he had only enough for himself and his family until the next harvest, and yet his teeth chattered and his bones shivered despite the heat of Central Africa. "That old healer," he said, "he has tricked me into giving away all that I have. For that," he said, "I will kill him." And so he started to the old wise man's village as fast as his shaking legs would carry him. Well, the old wise man was resting in a hammock under the eaves of his house when the cold man arrived. "Why am I not cured?" demanded the man. "Why do I, when I sit in the shade, even when the sun is blazing hot, still feel cold?" The healer sat up and looked at the angry man. "Did you give loving kindness with your rice?" he asked. "No," shouted the man. "I am buying warmth, not giving kindness." "Then you shall die poor as well as cold," said the wise man. And that is, in fact, what happened, because the man refused to learn compassion. And on the day of his death, the sun held itself back from being warm so that all the people of the village would remember that only genuine kindness can warm a cold heart. And then a contemporary reading from my colleague Jane Malden. A timely reading, as it turns out. A few days after Hurricane Andrew devastated South Florida and parts of Louisiana, I heard someone neatly wrapping up the events as bad theology. I was listening to my favorite public radio program when a report described a worship service in a Florida church that had only been mildly damaged by the hurricane. Volunteers had mended a few holes in the roof with donated plywood, and the worship services continued as planned. The minister, however, he found deep significance in the lack of major harm that had been done to the church. "I have driven by the Lakeside Baptist Church," he shouted. It is gone. I have driven by Main Street Baptist Church. It too is gone. I have even driven by the Believers Baptist Church. It too is gone. But, my friends, God has spared us. God has spared us. How easy it is, Malden writes, for some people to examine the conditions of their lives and conclude that they are better loved by the powers of the universe than perhaps a Somalian woman with 3 children who is starving in the desert. How easy it is for some people living in comfortable conditions to believe that somehow they deserve everything that they have, and that a man born and raised in the inner city slums deserves his lot in life too. It would be easy and comfortable to believe all these things, she says, but I do not. I am convinced that we are all interconnected, and therefore we are all responsible for one another. It is hard to choose my words judiciously after hearing such an adamant declaration of bad theology. And yet, after the sad and the sarcastic responses finish playing through my head, one certainty remains, that we who believe otherwise must not remain quiet. To keep our message to ourselves allows this kind of bad theology to become the theology of America. I suspect there's at least one person in this room who remembers the late music director of the First Unitarian Society, a fellow by the name of Ellsworth Snyder. He was our music director for 30 years. And Ellsworth was known, in instances of misfortune or injustice or disappointment, to respond simply, routinely, with the phrase, "Life is not simple." For him, it was a statement not of surrender, but rather of a certain acceptance of life in all of its unpredictability, with all of its attendant difficulties. Ellsworth tried to maintain a certain stoic equanimity when developments did not meet his expectations, when any given outcome seemed to him to be unfair. Now, others might have responded differently, seeking a rationale or an explanation for ill fortune or for good fortune. In the wake of both Hurricanes Katrina and Sandy, there were plenty of folks around who dismissed the possibility that such severe weather events might conceivably be the result of something as mundane as anthropogenic climate change. No, to these people, it made sense that these disasters, these catastrophes, reflected God's judgment as divinely imposed punishment for the sins of same-sex marriage, abortion, and separation of church and state. These weather events, they declared, were eminently fair. But as Jane Malden pointed out, this is nothing more than really, really bad theology. God, however you might conceive of him or her, is not a cosmic Santa Claus who purposely distributes rewards and punishments according to some abstruse formula known only to him. If there is a God, he or she may be better understood as that creative force who gave human beings the requisite powers, love, compassion, and reason, to fashion for ourselves a more just, equitable, and sustainable world. Ultimately, it is up to us to make life less difficult and more delightful. But putting aside, for now, the unresolvable question of God's purpose and intent for humankind, we might ask whether greater fairness is worth pursuing in our own communities, whether it should be for us a top priority. I believe it is, because the fundamental lack of fairness within a social system, that breeds resent, indignation, hatred, and ultimately social unrest. It makes people cynical. It reduces their faith in institutions in general. It does not take a sociology degree, David Callahan writes, to predict that a society ever more stratified along social and economic lines will be one where people trust each other less and may be more likely to live by the commandment, do unto others before they do unto you. Today in the United States, faith not only in the federal government, but in corporations, universities, healthcare providers, and religious bodies, faith in all these institutions has declined dramatically. And in many instances, that's because people feel that their voice has been excluded, their needs routinely discounted, their personhood undervalued, and that the deck has been stacked against them. How accurate is that perception? Have the systems that we have devised become less fair in recent times? Significant evidence would seem to support that conclusion. So consider, if you will, the salary structure at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. The salary structure, where the head football coach, whose team lost yesterday, by the way, whose head football coach earns in salary alone $2.5 million a year. Does not count his bonuses and his endorsement income. While at the same time, an internationally respected history professor, my friend Bill Cronin, struggles to pay his children's college tuition. And Brett Bielema is by no means the best compensated college football coach in America. That honor goes to the University of Alabama's Nick Saban, who earns in salary alone $5.5 million a year. Or take the American military. At a time when the possibility of conflict with a rival power, a superpower like Russia or China, is very, very remote, defense spending continues to burgeon. Indeed, at $740 billion in 2011, the Pentagon's budget is a third larger than that of the next 10 highest spending nations combined. Moreover, the U.S. military accounts for nearly half of all military spending for the entire globe. As Winslow Wheeler observes, the U.S. defense budget is not just dominant, it is operating at a level completely independent of any perceived threat. But despite the absurdity of those figures, few politicians dare to challenge the status quo. The military's corporate clients are too influential, and the institution itself is too admired for any criticism to be taken seriously. And yet, if there are not sufficient funds to meet our pressing domestic needs, it's not because revenues are insufficient. That's not the only reason. It's also because we have a whole bunch of misplaced priorities. Recent developments may actually set the stage for a change in that status quo. The reputations of America's most highly decorated and admired commanders have been tarnished. And revelations of the lavish lifestyles enjoyed by high-ranking officers, well, just maybe that will lead to more serious scrutiny of exorbitant military spending. As Aaron O'Connell, a professor of history at the Naval Academy, recently wrote, "Were Dwight D. Eisenhower alive today, he would be aghast at our debt, our deficits, and our still expanding military-industrial complex. No institution," he says, "particularly one financed by us, the taxpayers, should be immune from thoughtful criticism." And he teaches at the Naval Academy. A fundamental lack of fairness is also evident in certain other areas. The other day, it was announced that the BP Corporation, British Petroleum, had pleaded guilty to numerous charges related to the Deepwater Horizon blowout in the Gulf of Mexico 2.5 years ago. Almost 5 million barrels of oil and hundreds of gallons of toxic dispersal agents were released into the Gulf of Mexico, wreaking havoc on the United States' most productive fishing grounds. The settlement calls for BP to cough up $4.5 billion, the largest fine ever imposed for corporate malfeasance. But $4.5 billion is considerably less than BP's profits for a single quarter in a given year. Many of those who have made their living harvesting shellfish in that region are less than satisfied with that judgment. Compensation for their losses, average fishermen in the Gulf, those are still years and years away, because the finest lawyers that money can buy will be tying up the fishermen's claims into the unforeseeable future. Developments in the overall economy are also worth considering, for it is here that the principle of fairness has suffered the most. As recently as the 1960s, the United States boasted one of the most egalitarian economic systems in the developed world. But conditions, as we know, have changed. Today, our economy in this country is one of the least equitable in the developed world. The statistics here are sobering. From 1948 to 1973, The productivity of non-farm American workers nearly doubled. Productivity nearly doubled. And so did hourly compensation, wages plus benefits. The result? A vibrant middle class. Now, from 1976 to 2011, productivity again rose by 80%. But during this most recent period, hourly compensation for the average worker increased by only 10%. Furthermore, according to the Economic Policy Institute, for the 7-year period leading up to 2007, just before the recession, this was a time of robust growth, 2000 to 2007. During that period of time, the richest 10% of the population received virtually 100% of all of the financial benefits generated during that period. 100%. And since then, since that time, 2007, well, the economy has been on the rebound. Fortune 500 companies, insurance firms, banks, they've all been recovering rather nicely. But not the average worker, whose wages and benefits have either stagnated or continued to decline. Two recent cases in point, very particular cases. Despite record profits last year, the Caterpillar Corporation has demanded from its workers a wage freeze and cutbacks in the company's health plan. At the same time, highly regarded firms such as Microsoft, Hewlett-Packard, Intel, Verizon have been hiring more and more temporary help to do high-level, often sophisticated jobs on a more or less permanent basis. These folks are now called perma-temps. And they don't get health care, and they don't get retirement. They don't get all of the other benefits that full-time employees would normally receive, because as temps, they are not entitled to them. As one observer put it, if Microsoft cannot afford to treat all of its employees well, then no company in the history of the world can. Now, at the same time that the compensation for American wage earners has been declining, the tax burden has been shifting. In 1972, households in the $1 million earning bracket kept 53% of what they earned. 47% was taxed. Today, those same households earning more than $1 million a year, they keep 73% of what they earned. At the end of World War II, for every dollar that Uncle Sam collected from the average taxpayer, Uncle Sam also collected $1.50 from U.S. corporations. For every dollar that you or I contribute today, corporations chip in 25 cents. Moreover, although it earned over $14 billion in profits last year, General Electric actually paid no federal taxes. Neither did other highly profitable firms, including Boeing, Mattel, Verizon, and Wells Fargo. Despite a surging stock market, overall corporate taxes are at their lowest level in 40 years. Now, economic inequality can conceivably be justified if people believe that the playing field is level and that everyone is getting an equal shot at hitting it big. As Americans, we have historically supported equality of opportunity, but not necessarily equality of outcome. As Paul Ryan repeatedly emphasized before the last election, if you play by the rules and if you work hard, odds are good in America that you are going to succeed. But truth be told, the economic playing field has been decisively tilted to favor the well-to-do. Today, someone who is lucky enough to be born into the top bracket of American families is 7 times as likely to end up in that same bracket as someone who is born into the bottom tier of the economic ladder. There are several reasons for this. Admission to a top-tier university is an important factor, and increasingly the most prestigious of those universities favor those who already are wealthy, those who can afford to live in affluent areas with good public schools, those who can afford the kind of coaching that's required to excel on standardized admission tests like the SAT and the ACT. In fact, SAT and ACT scores are more closely related to parental income than to any other single variable. As Christopher Hayes observes, over time, a society will grow both more unequal and less mobile as those who ascend to its heights create a means of preserving their privilege, and they find a way to pass that privilege on to future generations. There is a growing body of evidence, he says, that at the same time that inequality has been growing at an unprecedented rate, social mobility in the United States has been steadily declining. So why should we care about inequality and about a lack of basic fairness? There are several reasons. First, as I mentioned earlier, it creates social malaise. In countries where there is a significant wealth gap, crime, teenage birth rates, substance abuse all increase. Moreover, inequality has a negative effect on public health. With only 5% of the world's population, the U.S. now consumes more than 65% of the global production of psychotropic drugs, tranquilizers, and mood elevators. The incidence of diseases associated with chronic stress is also higher in countries where there's a significant wage and income gap. And then, two, inequality creates deep fissures in the social fabric. According to Michael Sandel, a professor of political philosophy at Harvard, in an increasingly unequal society, it's more and more difficult to sustain the mutual respect of all citizens for one another. This is what he says. As the gap between rich and poor deepens, the affluent and the disadvantaged live increasingly in separate lives. We reside and we work and we shop and we play in different places. We send our children to different schools. Gradually, we cease to share a common life. And this, he says, makes democracy difficult to sustain because it becomes ever harder to think of ourselves as citizens sharing a common purpose. I call this the corruption of civic virtue, Sandel says. It is an erosion of the sense that we are all in this together. Or, as the late Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis warned 3/4 of a century ago, we can either have democracy in this country, or we can have great wealth and power concentrated in the hands of the few. But we cannot have both. Now, fairness does not require perfect equality. It only requires a certain reasonable proportionality between and among citizens. For instance, the British writer and social critic George Orwell once said that he kind of liked the idea of living in a world where the richest individual had 10 times more money than the poorest individual. Orwell would be aghast to learn that in the United States today, the richest 400 of our citizens have 10,000 times more income than the bottom 90% of taxpayers. Now, people might say, come on, that's just the way the world works. That's the way that free enterprise works. But Bill Moyer's reply is saying, no, this is the way that we have made our world to work. And if we've made it this way, we can change the way it works. There are, of course, certain features of the current economy that would be difficult to change. Sophisticated labor-saving technology, that's not going to go away. Nor is an increasingly globalized workforce, not going to go away. Unlike in the decades following World War II, the United States has been experiencing in recent years a labor surplus, which means that employers can be more selective and far less generous than they were in the past. In negotiations today between labor and management, the former, labor, are at a serious disadvantage. And yet it is not a given that in order to stay competitive, American corporations must continually be cutting their labor costs to the bone. Average compensation for full-time workers in robust economies like Germany and France and Finland and Sweden, their average salaries are significantly higher than those in this country. But then again, their political systems are not contaminated by corporate money to the extent that ours is. Workers in those countries actually participate in corporate decision-making. The differential between executive and worker salaries is just a fraction of ours in Western Europe. And the tax burden does not fall disproportionately on the middle class. These are all things that we can control if we want to. All of which suggests that a fairer system is possible if we can find the political will to adopt some of the common sense policies that have already proven successful in other parts of the world. And a good first step, I believe, would be to pass a constitutional amendment that would deny corporations the status of persons, a legal concept that has caused all kinds of political and economic mischief. A second step would be passage of a federal jobs act That measure would soak up surplus labor and put people back to work rebuilding the nation's infrastructure and putting more teachers and aides in our children's classrooms. A broad-based living wage campaign would also help. Community organizers in Baltimore, in San Francisco, in Madison, and in other cities have successfully waged such campaigns, and quite frankly, local businesses have learned to adapt, and the well-being of those communities is better than it was before. But ultimately, as with the African man who could never get warm, a change of heart is needed. In the post-World War II years, corporate leaders like Standard Oil of New Jersey's Frank Abrams and Henry Ford before him promoted and praised what is called stakeholder capitalism. It was management's job, Abrams wrote, to maintain an equitable working balance among the claims of variously affected interest groups, including stockholders, employees, customers, and the community at large. For the publicly traded companies that currently dominate the lion's share of our economy, there is no stakeholders capitalism. There's only one interest group whose needs and priorities matter, and that is the stockholder. And unless Wall Street is brought to heel, the average American worker is going to continue to be shortchanged. Justice, Marvin Ellison writes, is the virtue of seeking abundant life not just for the some, but for everyone. May we join our hearts and our hands in a long-term campaign to create that very abundance. Blessed be, and amen.